4 years ago, on a spring day in June, Shawn Atleo sat with his grandmother and he watched Prime Minister Harper apologize to First Nations people for the brutal system of residential schools.
These institutions gave rise to abuse or neglect and were inadequately controlled.
More than 100,000 children passed through those schools, torn away from their families and communities.
We apologize for failing to protect you.
Shawn's grandmother turned to him and said this: "Grandson, they are just beginning to see us." She had raised 17 children. All went to residential schools, but not Shawn. He was the first in his family not to go, and against the odds, he finished high school and then university with a master's in education. Now, when he returned to the Hauset Nation on Vancouver Island, Shawn worked as a community activist and leader. And now, as chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Shawn represents more than 700,000 people across Canada. He says education is the key to survival for Native communities. Only 40% of Native children graduate from high school, half the rate of non-Native kids. And there are other serious problems: housing, economic development, and the Indian Act.
It is well past time that we begin to undo the damage that act has inflicted on our peoples and to our partnership.
Shawn says these are just some of the areas that need to be revisited by Canada's federal government and its First Nations people.
And we must not fail.
Please welcome the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Shawn A-in-chut Atleo. So, first of all, thanks for coming back. What did you think when you saw Eighth Fire, the first one?
Absolutely amazing. Throw out mad props to Wob and to everyone who put that together. It was one of the first times it felt like I saw myself reflected back, in the mainstream. Besides George having Wob on, which is really important too, to have this be brought out to the Canadian consciousness, and for me as the First Nations and for all of our people to see ourselves reflected back like that, I have to tell you, I was moved. Very emotional moment, as it feels like perhaps, are we at that tipping point?
It seems like something's different in the conversation these days. Do you feel that way?
It really does. Canadians from all walks of life. When I made a trip to Attawapiskat in December, I was sent with this package, these letters from kids in elementary school from Ottawa. And when I delivered it, it was just one of those moments where it kind of represents that we've come from this deep disconnect. When the Governor General was speaking at our meeting, he helped remind the whole country about the history of First Nations relations with newcomers, and going back to before the Royal Proclamation, talked about Champlain. And of course, this is the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812. A lot of First Nations lives lost, fighting shoulder to shoulder, not as subjects, but as allies. And so there's this hope that we'll return back to that sentiment. But really, it's about relationships between people in the end.
All right, so tell me about this meeting with Stephen Harper, because from what I understand, he was only supposed to show up for the beginning, but he ended up staying all day. How do you feel about it?
Well, in the words of one chief, at the end of the day, there was a lot of skepticism, and because we got deep mistrust that goes a long ways back. A sense of broken promises right from, right after the first treaties were forged. And it's been a litany of that: residential schools, Indian Act. And so it's not easy for First Nations to suggest that maybe this time something is going to be different. And so the Prime Minister, I know, he was scheduled to be off to the Economic Forum in Switzerland. And I, with the encouragement of our people, said, it would be really good to consider, maximizing time. I know that the world of Prime Minister is important. Maybe we have an opportunity here. And one chief said it was respectful, that he took the time to really listen, because that's what learning is all about. It's listening for understanding what each other's perspectives are. That's what the Governor General reminded us was there in the very beginning. Mm-hmm. Somehow we've strayed, and it's time to return to that sentiment.
Well, how do you get the sense that he's going to... Because Paul Martin talked about how the Kelowna Accord was really the step, and when they scrapped it, if they were interested in really building this relationship, that the Kelowna Accord would have stayed, right? And so do you get the sense that there's going to be meaningful change now? Well,
I'm sure hopeful. The last time...
Was that with your heart or your head that you're hopeful, though?
Well, it's both. Yeah. And that's what we've got to connect. We can think about things from an intellectual perspective, but this has to be about the caring between people and relationships between people, and recognizing that we have grown so far apart. And so coming out of this meeting, so very proud and inspired by our people, the way that we continue to stand firm, that we want to transform education success for our children, and do so at the same time in standing firmly in the principle of what we've inherited in our treaty rights, in our inherent rights. Thinking about late George Manuel, who led the charge back in 1969 to reject the white paper, which was about an attempt to assimilate First Nations into society. This is about respect, mutual recognition. And that's what my late grandmother reminded me as well. Right. They're beginning to see us.
Here's the thing. The Indian Act is essentially an industry around this relationship. How do you begin to dismantle something so big a part of the relationship?
It's helpful, first of all, that the Prime Minister, this is one element that occurred, said, the federal government doesn't have a grand scheme to unilaterally get rid of the Indian Act. That was an important message to hear, because those efforts in the past have failed, and if we need to return to the original treaty relationship, which is a full partnership. So let's be clear. Some First Nations are already out from underneath the Indian Act. They've negotiated modern forms of self-government and treaties, and it no longer applies to them. There has been unilateral attempts to really pull apart the Indian Act on the part of the federal government. And First Nations who have treaties that go a long way back, some as far back as over 260 years, are still seeking a willing Crown partner to implement those treaties. Those are all aspects that were brought, and those issues were shared directly with the Prime Minister, as well as with about a third of his cabinet was there.
And so the process of when you get rid of it, like, what are we talking, 10 years, 15 years? Have you got, they don't have a scheme, but have you guys got a plan?
Absolutely. That was what makes me so very, very proud. First Nations came in, it was so very clear. Going back to the 70s, we have plans for Indian control of Indian education, is what it was called back in the 70s. Right. First Nations control, First Nations education, to see our jurisdiction recognized and supported, and for First Nations to build those systems themselves. In places like the Atlantic, the Mi'kmaq have achieved upwards of an 80% success rate. We can draw inspiration from examples like that, but we need to grow that throughout the entire country, because as Canada, I think, witnessed most recently, and the Eighth Fire provides an excellent overview. Particularly, so much of it's driven by our artist community and by our storytellers, people like Wob and people like Drew Hayden Taylor, and we've got incredible storytellers and artists. They're really helping to lift the consciousness as well. And so that's the other element of this, is that we don't rely on a single government or a single prime minister or a national chief or any individual for this work to happen. That we as a country be seized by this and say, you know what, we didn't write that Indian Act, we didn't open those residential schools where my late grandmother and my dad went to, but what we can do is we can share responsibility for getting on with addressing the future, and that is making sure that kids are supported.
What is the idea, because so much of this, for lots of legitimate reasons, is an emotional relationship and levels of distrust, that there are some who said that that's got to become secondary right now, that the real way to start to fix this relationship is to focus on the non-emotional, economic win-wins, that mutually beneficial business part of the relationship. Do you agree with that?
Well, I don't see that you disconnect these aspects. They're completely and inextricably linked. We have dire conditions and deep poverty. We've got communities in the far north, and yet they may be adjacent to some of the biggest resource development countries and the projects in this country. And what we need to do is we need to put those elements together. First Nations can and must have a say in designing more sustainable resource development within our country, in our territories. First Nations feel most acutely issues around climate change and problems with the environment. I know that as a story from my own home territory.
But never mind just First Nations responsibilities. Any environmentalist feels in this country like those concerns are back burner to the business gains. So do you actually think that you're going to be able to get Ottawa to pay attention, or these companies to pay attention to that? They won't do it for anybody.
Well, First Nations are getting the attention of companies, not only here but around the world. The passage of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was an important moment, and it was important that Canada endorsed that 2 years ago. Within it, it describes two notions actually, that are really important, that Canada is actually a successor state and inherits an obligation to work with First Nations to implement their treaties. And secondly, that First Nations would have a say in designing their future, whether it's education, health, child welfare, etc. It also says that when it comes to activities on their lands and developments, that they must have free, prior, and informed consent. And so whether we look to advancements in common law in this country, look back to the Royal Proclamation, the treaties, the constitutional talks. This most recent United Nations declaration recognized that Indigenous rights are real, they are legal in nature, and we have to work these issues out. So together we must plan what a sustainable future looks like.
Does it have to become a strictly legal issue for you to get to a place where you're happy with the results?
No, in the end, it's a relationship issue, and it's about people, together working through the development of a shared vision about what our world should look like. I don't have to go so far back as my late grandfather, who he didn't need Al Gore, although it was helpful that he sparked this notion about, for the world, issues of climate change. My late grandfather was telling me about the changes in the environment back home in housing, issues with our fisheries. And then you pile on top of that things like clear-cut logging or fish farming. So many externally imposed dynamic. And today, it's the energy sector. It's major project developments, pipelines, it's oil and gas, it's exploration. And those First Nations that were otherwise so isolated, so remote, guess where they are? They're right where all those resources are. So you better believe that First Nations are going to be key players into the future. So now is the time that we say, you know what, we've been lurching from conflict to conflict. We've got a disconnect between our peoples in this country. Let's seize this moment to do something about it.
So that's one relationship that you have to put together. Now, within your own community, there are lots of disparate voices. Everything from, conversations and emotional to armed insurrection. There's all kinds of ways to approach this. How do you unify that?
Well, I've been out on the roads, if you will. I know. I feel as passionate as all of our people do about the issues that we face and the conditions that we face. The elders, particularly in the lead up to this meeting, they were reminding us about the need to, as Black Elk says, that our sole purpose in the universe is relationality. And the purpose of each human is to create, maintain, and uphold relationships. And this is not an easy task. I'm reminded that there's one of two roads when it comes to this work of reconciling these differences we're talking about. There is the hard road or the harder road. I wish there was an easy road. There is no easy road.
Sad but true.
And the harder road is the one that is full of conflict. And we've had that. We've had Oka, we've had Gustafson, we've had Burnt Church.
But is that necessary to have those? Can you see the value in that?
Well, in other countries around the world, we have the Arab Spring. And we have people's movements. And after all, this has to be about the people and people's relationships with one another and the environment around us. I end up in this sort of work looking to support addressing the need for better relationships between peoples. And it does require hard work. And the chief said, you know what, Shawn, we need to ensure that the Crown comes and hears what it is we're challenged with. It was important for the Governor General to be there because, as I mentioned earlier, some of these, the treaty relationships predate the establishment of Canada. Canada is formed. We have, the War of 1812. If First Nations weren't there shoulder to shoulder, maybe this country looks a lot different than what we've got now.
It certainly would. Thanks for coming on, man. It's always great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. There's an National Secretary of First Nations, Shawn A-in-chut Atleo. We'll be right back.